I could see tears in her eyes because every stitch had broken. All my gut was just hanging out.
Welcome to the podcast where we track down Australian war veterans, have a chat with them, and hear their stories. I'm Alex Lloyd, and this is Life on the Line.
They were building positions in there
if
for
anything
a
happened
fight.
to us, by the time anyone got to us,
I think it was chaos.
the weather was so bad there would be
I used to
nobody
run
left.
with boots full of blood.
And the next thing I hear was alarms,
Chances of
screaming.
survival were very, very slim.
The soldiers didn't want to go into the ambushes, so they'd send the kids in first. And so he was sent in first into an ambush and he got shot in the stomach.
It was very hard for me, very hard for my family.
And the plane burst into
Proud of the
flames.
crew, proud of what I've achieved and what I'm
To
doing.
volunteer for service was in effect to put your life on the line.
Welcome to the final episode for Season 2 of Life on the Line. For this last veteran conversation, I spoke with Jack Bell. Jack is a World War II veteran and a survivor of Italian and Nazi prisoner of war camps. I'm Alex Lloyd, and today I'm in Melbourne with Jack Bell. Jack, thanks for having me in your home and for coming on the show.
Yeah, my pleasure, no trouble, Alex.
Now, Jack, when were you born?
20th of December 1917,
And where was that?
in a little place, Toowong, in the suburb of Brisbane.
And what was your family like?
The typical family of that age, because it was the end of the First World War and there was a lot of restrictions, I believe. But my father and mother worked hard during their lives, and they had 4 kids and I looked after them. We moved from house to house till we built a house in what was then Church Street, Toowong. So I think there was 2 bedrooms plus a whole veranda where all the kids slept out in the veranda. And my father worked as a master joiner, building stairs and church pews and stuff like that. And my mother worked very hard for the church because when I was a little lad, the Depression really hit Australia when I was 9, 10, 11. And over the ensuing years, my father's business fell away because there was about 30% unemployment in Queensland, or maybe Australia, I'm not quite sure. And his workforce dropped from 85 to 25. So they were struggling as a company. And I went to work as a boy of 16 to a place called D&W Murray, which was a warehouse, a wholesale goods, clothing, etc. And I stayed there until the war broke out in 1939. But in 1938, I joined the militia force, an artillery section, which was had 25-pounders and howitzers as their armament. And all this armament was, of course, from the First World War, was very old, Mark IIs and Mark Vs. And when the war did break out, we went into camp for a month, and I decided that as I was acting sergeant on the gun, I was a gun layer originally, I could hit an anthill 3,000 yards away over hills and mountainous country without any problem after ranging shots. So I decided that I wouldn't stay in the militia, I'd join the Air Force. So when we got back to Brisbane in December, I applied to join the Air Force. Well, I couldn't get a discharge from the Army until my call-up came from the Air Force because as I was a volunteer, they couldn't stop me leaving. And I thought, well, that's good. I'm now in the Air Force, and I was called up for the 24th of May 1940. And about 40 or 50 of us arrived at the recruiting office in Creek Street, which was right opposite D&W Murray's. And I'll never forget that we were all outside ready to march to the South Brisbane Railway Station. And the boys in the warehouse called, "You'll be sorry," which was a cryptic phrase that would pass right through the war for anybody just joining up. You'll be sorry, because
They'd be sorry.
they were. A lot of them were. So we entrained to Sydney. Now, we all wanted to be pilots, of course, but it wasn't everybody couldn't be a pilot. So we got to the central station in Sydney, and they read out the names. They were pilots, read out names. They were navigators, read out names. They were wireless operators, air gunners. I was in the last category. So then from then on, we entrained into Ballarat, arrived there on the 27th, and it was cold as charity. Coming from Queensland to Ballarat in the end of May was like icebergs to me. I slept in my clothes, everything, a whole lot, all on, with my overcoat, the Sippy overcoat. and 3 blankets. We're housed in the Ballarat Showgrounds buildings, which was galvanised iron, sides and roof and a cement floor with one stove in the middle heating it, one little coal-fired stove. And there were probably, when I went in, there were easily 200 recruits in that building, sleeping on the cement floor, 3 sheet pieces of timber in a V-shape, wood, with a palliasse filled with straw as the mattress. What they call initial training was very easy for me because I'd been in the army, the militia, for 3 years, so that didn't worry me at all. But a lot of the boys didn't know their left from their right foot. But eventually everybody passed out from Ballarat and went up to Evans Head. We did move into the Ballarat Airgrove, I think it was in August, end of August. We moved into huts, which housed 25 to 30 in each hut, I expect, overseen by a corporal. And we went up to Evans Head in November to do the gunnery course. And the British government had sent out, I think, 16 or 18 Fairey battles, which now they were an aircraft that were underpowered, heavy, and were used in the early parts of the war, but they found to be obsolete. Of the 18, there was only 3 serviceable. The rest were still had their shrapnel holes and things in that needed to be repaired. My complete gunnery course in the air shooting a gun, which was a Vickers Go gun as it was called, was probably 40 hours flying. I went up, I think, 3 times for about 15 or 20 minutes, something like that. Might have been a little bit less. And everybody passed the gunnery course because nobody knew what the hell we were doing anyway. And the instructors, although a permanent Air Force, they weren't highly trained for this type of work at the start. So we were sent on our final leave, and then we were shipped out of Australia on the Aquitania. I think it was the 6th or 7th of February 1941. And our destination, we were told, whether it was true or not, we don't know, it was the United Kingdom. Well, we finished up in India for 3 or 4 weeks, resting there while transport was arranged. We finished up in Africa and arrived at Port Said, and I was put into a transit camp with all the others and eventually sent to Heliopolis. About 25, 26 were sent to Heliopolis. Now, we were all wireless operator air gunners, and when we got there, 20 of us were trained as cipher officers because there was lack of people to interpret, decipher the signals, which I never had to do anything about that because I was transferred or put on the strength of 216 Squadron, which was fitted out with Bristol Bombays, Vickers Valencias. And unfortunately, my transfer from the Middle East pool didn't arrive until August. Well, I was supposed to be on the strength since the June when I arrived at Heliopolis. So I finished up going there in August, and at that time, the actual front was rather fluid. We moved up to a little place called Merseyramm, and from there the offensive took place in November 6th, 17th, 18th against the German Africa Corps. Now, though everything went well, our duties were taken out of the bombing raids because our aircraft we were flying and were also obsolete. The Vickers Valente was originally designed in 1921, so it was a fabric wings and aircraft, and it was very slow. And the pilot and the navigator sat out in the front in an open cockpit with a windscreen up, and they used to use a pith helmet to keep the sun off them. There was a pilot, a navigator, later became observers, a wireless operator air gunner, a fitter and a rigger. There could be 2 pilots or 1 pilot. Some were double fitted, like two pilots, or rather single.
So in your role, you're having to juggle wireless ops and get on the gunner position if required.
If required. I was never required. Now, top speed of these were 80 miles an hour. And in a headwind, trucks would pass us on the ground because they were fast by the time if you strike a headwind, you're only doing about 30 or 40. And the trucks did actually pass us. We were doing transport, we were flying up, bringing back wounded from the front or taking up some medical supplies, replacement air crew or medical staff or whatever, and we used to fly. But the Valentias were very quickly taken out of service and only used in around Egypt and down to Somaliland. But the Bristol Bombay bore the brunt of it, and built by Halden Wolf they were shipbuilders, and they decided that because aircraft wasn't ballasted, according to Navy speculation, they would shift the main spar of the main wing 4 inches forward. Now, it doesn't seem very much, but when you're in an aircraft and the tanks are full of fuel and you're carrying a load and you've got an air gunner in the tail and you're flying along, after about 2.5 hours, the fuel in the tanks is lightened. You probably drop personnel in the aircraft, and it's just the tail gunner sitting there with the crew forward of the main spar. So what used to happen was, and we didn't find this out until about August, it might be November 41, we lost a number of aircraft crashing on the flight home. And what had happened was that the air gunner, the weight of him, when the fuel tanks are nearly empty and there's no load in it, the tail dropped, nosedive straight into the ground. From then on, we never had a tail gunner. The guns were taken out and the back turret was never used. We did do training jobs. For instance, we trained the first group of SAS personnel. They were formed under Captain David Sterling, who unfortunately saw his brother on the wire of Tobruk being shot slowly to death. And he was begging for mercy, to somebody to kill him, drove David to start this SAS. Now, this was an infiltration to get behind enemy lines and damage their actually...
This is the inaugural mission into Libya.
This is the initial one. Now, that was the first group of SAF ever formed that I'm aware of. There may be not, but I don't think so.
No, they were the first behind the lines as a whole new concept of a way to fight a war.
Yes, absolutely. What we used to do, they were flown in. Now, I was never on one of these aircraft, but I was flown in, and they were dropped 10 or 12 miles away from the targets they were looking at. And they were plastic bombs on only the port or starboard wing of the aircraft on the ground, not one of each, always the one wing. So that was very hard to bastardise, repair the aircraft. And it was very successful. But of course, they got captured, a lot of them got captured, a lot got killed. And on the night of the 17th, 18th of November, unfortunately, the 3 aircraft went back, only one really got back. One was completely lost. They were over 30 miles off course due to the high winds. And the second aircraft was force landed. And I never met anybody other than one person from that group during the war who was a prisoner. I don't know how many finished up prisoners. I haven't got a clue.
Can you share with me a bit about the base you were at for 216 Squadron, the atmosphere, the sights and sounds?
Well, the base at Merseyramm was... unfortunately, there was these sandstorms used to come in quite regularly, and if you didn't have a lead rope to get to your tent, you couldn't get there. But our main job from then on was carrying supplies. Now, regularly, I mean, I don't know, my logbook was lost in 1952 in a flood, but we did a lot of flights, but we never recorded half of them because we were only flying to Cyprus or flying to Tel Aviv or down to Sudan. And there was nothing meaningful about it. But we're always bringing back wounded or taking medical supplies or replacement staff. And it was the worst trips that we did, I think, was in the Battle of the Sidi Rezaiq, which was a tank battle of about 1,000 tanks involved, of which I only think about a third were German, the rest were British forces. But the tanks that the British forces had were far sub to what the Germans had. I mean, they just blew them out like tin cans. And I did 3 trips up to the front. When the front was over this hill, we used to land behind, and they'd bring these stretcher cases out. And we could only about 13 or 14 on it, but we always carried extra ones, even just lying on the floor if we possibly get them on the aircraft. And it was staggering. We were not permitted to give them any food or water. All we could do was to wet their parched lips. Now, some of these men were so horribly burnt, the pain must have been excruciating, although the adrenaline slips in. Maybe they didn't feel as much as they should have, but it was terribly hard for us not to give them water because they had stomach wounds, all sorts of problems. I doubt that half of them would have lived anyway. I don't know, but But at this stage, you didn't think much about it because it's just war. You just we're doing a job. And I'll never forget, we used to do trips to Cyprus, Nicosia we used to land at. We'd go to Tel Aviv, Now, we're all issued with cigarettes in the Air Force, about 60 cigarettes a week. So we used to save these up. They're Woodbines. They were terrible cigarettes. And we'd go to Tel Aviv. We'd take all these issued cigarettes to the crew. It was a racket work by the squadron. So we'd sell the cigarettes in Tel Aviv to buy cases of oranges. And then we'd fly the oranges to Nicosia, and we'd trade the oranges for bottles of Scotch whiskey, which is only 4 and 6 months, it was nothing at all.
Sounds like a good trade to me.
Well, it was a good trade because when we came back, we sold them to the officers' mess for 12 and 6 and kept the rest ourselves and had free nights in them in the sergeant's mess. Well, it worked out very well because they couldn't buy Scotch whiskey for 12 and 6 in Cairo anyway. So it worked out well.
I'd go to one of your parties in a heartbeat.
Well, just as a bit of a side on, but my war really wasn't that bad. I never had to face the enemy in direct fire or anything like that, except when I was shot down. So I know very little about the actual ground war at all.
Did you ever have a chance to interact with the locals, or?
Well, yes and no. Unfortunately, though, the Brits weren't very kind to the Egyptian people. They were not slaves exactly, but they were treated very, very badly. They were terribly paid. Well, I suppose that was the norm for the income at the time. I'm not quite sure. But I remember one driver telling me, he said, if you run into what they termed them as jippos and you knocked them down, you ran back and ran over them, killed them, because it was cheaper for the British government to bury them than it was to treat them in the hospital.
I have no words. That's appalling.
Well, I mean, you can imagine how the Australians felt. They were horrified that this driver said this. Whether it ever happened, we don't know because he was only a driver. But I don't know. But I don't think that I saw any mixed race going on. I don't remember any. There possibly could have been, but I don't know. But in the hierarchy of the Egyptian lifestyle, they were very nice people. Absolutely, they were. But when you got out in the desert, well, they were on their camels and they were nomads. But they knew where all the water holes were. That was the big thing that we needed to get water when we were flying around.
The authorities had to cooperate with them no matter what wartime imperial hubris they were acting under.
Exactly. That was exactly what it was. And fair enough. But to me now it was horrible. But when we were there, well, it was just part of the deal. That was the way that it went.
Now, Jack, the 23rd of January, 1942. Talk me through that day.
Well, the 23rd of January, we weren't a part of a fixed crew, Tony and I. We were replacements on anybody would arrest or had to sick or something. We took their place. We took off this morning. Now the intention was we were to fly to a little place called Masous, which was south of Benghazi, to pick up brigade headquarters. And we'd had on board a couple of pilots, medical supplies, and a medic. Now, I don't know whether it's a doctor or just a medical boy. I don't know, because you don't sort of meet these. They come in, you get in, they load the plane up, away you go. We set the course for Masous, and there was a very strong headwind. Because in the desert, the clouds are pretty low first thing in the morning. So decided we fly at 3,000 feet to get up over it. This is the direction from the officer in charge of the flight. And to descend to 1,000 feet under the cloud bank as we approached Masous. Well, unfortunately, we were off course. And we're probably 30 miles south of Masous when we came out under the cloud bank. And the pilot corrected the course to fly to Masous. And coming down over the escarpment to land at Masous, we ran across, we didn't know, an echelon of tanks from the 15th Panzer Division with their supporting vehicles, their AK vehicles. We probably were maybe 700, 800 feet when the attack took place. And it was just, if you can imagine a piece of brown paper, the rattle of these little .3 bullets through the wing, because the wing's 94 feet long, it's very wide. It was like tearing a piece of brown paper slowly. You could hear it. And then .5s took off. Of course, the Jerry's had the Bofors gun. We didn't know what they were, just a hell of a bloody noise going on. And the plane burst into flames. Now, an 88 shell, fortunately for us, was not armour-piercing, came through behind the pilot and went up out the aircraft and then exploded, fortunately. But the shrapnel came down the first pilot, Flight Lieutenant Wilcox, Pluto, he was so badly injured in one leg that he lost it that same day in the hospital, but it killed Tony Carter outright. Now, the second pilot didn't get a scratch, not one piece of shrapnel, nothing. He was sitting right in front of Tony. Now, I was sitting behind the transmitter and the radio, so I had some protection. Well, it landed, hit there, and a shell group came down. Now, I only got hit up the right leg, through the abdomen, up to the arm here. Frankly, I thought, God, this is it, I'm gone, this is it. And the aircraft was on fire, and the second pilot took over and brought it down. Now, unbeknownst to us, we didn't know the Jerrys were there. We actually, the second pilot thought it was our own ground fire, was a Free French or something was attacking us in mistake. Anyway, landed quite roughly, but the door was opened by the fitter or the rigger, I'm not quite sure, at the back, so they would start to get out. Now, one of the pilots we were carrying had his right arm so lacerated they had to remove that. Now, I got out of the aircraft. As I got out, I put my hand around the side of it to give leverage, because I didn't realise I was so badly wounded as I was.
You weren't in much pain?
No, the adrenaline hit in, you just get out, you know.
Did you register that you had blood down the side?
Well, no, not really, because I was wearing a wool jacket. You know, these little bits of shrapnel did.
So the extent of your injuries, you just didn't really realise?
I didn't really know. All I knew, a burning sensation with abdomen. Well, that was, of course, the shrapnel in the intestine. Flying Officer Bateman, who's the second pilot, called out, said, "Jack, will you come round and help me get Pluto out?" Now, in the front of the aircraft, there's an escape hatch, which pilots could use. And he'd opened that. Pluto was sitting with his legs dangling out of it. And he said, "Well, can you catch him?" Well, now, I wasn't that far away. I mean, his legs were there when I was standing there. But underneath, because when a body falls on top of it, you're injured, it's sort of, boy, with a bang. Anyway, we managed to get him here. Then he jumped out. We managed to get Wilcox a little bit away. And a little German orderly came up. You could tell he was very frightened. He was scared to death. And he got a piece of plaster out about that square, and lifted the jacket up and put over one of the holes in my stomach because I was bleeding so badly. We were put on stretchers and taken in a captured British ambulance to a little place called Antlat, where they had the German 15th Division field hospital was. Now, we had nothing to drink. But we're all lined up outside this. I can never forget it, lined outside this hospital, probably 20 or 30 of us, I can imagine. Not only wounded from our area, but also other wounded from the German side.
And sorry, from your plane, did everyone but Tony survive?
Yes, they all survived. The pilot and the English pilot, Wilson, they were repatriated in, I think, October that year back to Britain because they'd lost an arm and a leg. You see, they were non-combatants from then on, so they sent them home. But two German doctors and a padre came across and walked up and down assessing the wounded. Now, there were two German Air Force boys who'd been shot down by hurricanes, and they were badly wounded in the abdomen, not only in the abdomen, elsewhere. I was number 3. They first two went in, I was number 3. Now, irrespective of didn't care with POWs, or the order was how badly wounded you went in. Now, I don't remember much at all from then on because I was drugged up. But a couple of days later, the German doctor came to see me and he said what he'd done. He'd removed a bit of intestine and patched me up and should be okay. But he spoke perfect English. And I said, "Where did you learn your English?" Oh, he said, "I learnt it in Germany after the First World War. I was a graduate after the war, and I decided that part of the reparations, as we were requested, would we go to England to practice." So he said, I thought, well, maybe it'd be better there than here. So he said, I went to England, and he said, I trained in hospitals there, and he finished up as the Harley Street abdominal specialist. But I didn't know, because over the course of the next few days, he imparted this knowledge to me. And he gave me his address on a piece of paper, and I had that in my paybook, in my pocket. He said that they don't trust me, He said, I'm only second in charge, but he's an abdominal specialist. Now, the two German pilots died, and I lived. Now, you can imagine in a German hospital tent what the attitude was from the boys there, the German boys, I mean, why do you live and they died, you know? I mean,
Great suspicion.
well, I had a gun pointed at my head, you know, and because I told them to shut up because they were listening to Hitler on the radio, and it's just a noise to me. It was annoying me, you know? And I can understand how they felt about that because now, but at the time I didn't. Unfortunately, he came to see me on 7 or 8 days later, I forget exactly, but he said, now look, we've got to hand you all the wounded over to the Italians. We only take walking wounded or unwounded prisoners. So he said, now you'll be leaving in the morning. He said, you'll be on the back of a truck, a flat top, to go to Tripoli, which is about 400 miles away. And he said, I will redress your wound. Now I had 14 lateral stitches and 2 over-tying stitches to hold the abdomen. That's where he put those in that morning. Bound me up in wide bandages, round and round, really tight bandages. And he gave me a shot of morphine in my left leg. And I'm not sure how many he gave me, maybe 8 or 10 files. He didn't have to do that, but he did. And I've had those in my other battle dress jacket. And he said, every night and every morning, you jab yourself. Because he said, you're going on a truck. The road to Tripoli is desert. Army vehicles will have preference on the roads. You might have to go off track. And he said, goodness knows what will happen. The first night, now, there was a little bit of a canopy on this truck, but we couldn't move around. I couldn't get up and move it anyway. So the first night we arrived at this little Italian depot, and I was taken out on the train, and I was just wheeled over like this. Now, you can't blame the Italian boys for that. They were at war. You know, what's this? You know, they're swearing, obviously. And, of course, that hurt. And I don't remember really, but it was shocking to me. But anyway, I gave myself a bit, and I thought, now, before you leave in the morning, jab, before you get off that truck, jab yourself. So the next 3 days, it was quite...
delirious.
I don't know. I haven't got a clue. Nothing. I know we were strafed. But arriving at Tripoli, this is the most amazing thing to me. I can never get over it. I was put in a room in this hospital on my own. Now, I wasn't conscious, obviously, you know, but the next day, an Italian nurse came in. She would be probably in her 50s, I would think, something, but she looked old to me, but, you know, that...
When you're that age.
Yeah, that age, that's old. It could have been 40s. But she spoke reasonably good English. Probably this was why I was put here. I don't know. Italian doctor came in and he said, the nurse will dress your wound. I'd given the files of morphine to her and she'd administered one to me, so I was hazy. But I can remember her sitting there looking over me. Her eyes, I could see tears in her eyes because every stitch had broken. All my gut was just hanging out. She washed me, it must be a considerable time. And so anyway, she jabbed me and I went back to sleep. And the next morning she said, you haven't eaten because I've been fed intravenously. I never had any food or anything. She said, you have to eat, otherwise you'll die. So she brought in a little bowl of pasta. And I thought, so I tried to eat it. I could eat because I'd had Italian restaurant in Brisbane before the war I used to go to, so I couldn't taste it. It was terrible. And I threw it up. So she went out and there was a quince tree outside and she went and picked quinces and boiled them up and put sugar in it to get me to get her taste buds back. And she saved my life. You know, that food was really marvellous. Probably stayed there a few days. I wouldn't know how many. We sailed from Italy on the 14th of February on the Aquila, which was a passenger liner that used to come to Australia before the war. Now, on the matron in charge was a lass called Countess Jano, the wife of the Italian foreign minister, who was also Mussolini's daughter. Now, she spoke English like you and I speak English, and she was both good to the prisoners as well as their own Italian wounded that were on the ship. And she used to talk to the boys, which I thought was very good. I couldn't walk, I was still a stretcher case, and to go to the toilet, they used to lift me off the bed and I used to walk with my hands backwards like that and scramble back to the toilet. Then they had to lift me on, lift me off and take me back. On the halfway over, of course, Singapore fell. She quite proudly came to tell us, of course, naturally. We didn't believe her. There was no information at all, just that Singapore fell. Didn't believe. So we berthed in Naples. We were taken to a little village called Caserta, to a prison camp hospital run by a British Major Martin, a nice fella. He said, I can't do anything for you. He said, I haven't got any drugs of any description whatsoever. He said, all I can do is operate. Now, to operate, he had two big, strong blokes that held the patient down, and he just had to cut into him. They had nothing to nullify pain. Ultimately, the wound healed over, and I then shifted in up to a little place called Palm at Milan. By this time, I was walking and I was bent over like that. I was bent right over. And nobody told me. The doctor, Major Martin, should have said, what you should do is straighten yourself, because nobody gave me any advice whatsoever.
Because you're compressing your organs down.
Yeah, that's right. You're holding it in. And eventually got to Palma, a naval lieutenant commander, Palmer, Skippy Palmer. He was a prisoner there. There was a lot of wounded, but practically ready to go to camps. So he decided he was going to organise an escape. He said, well, we'll pinch a yacht out of the harbour in Milan. So I sold my watch to an Italian orderly for 2 slabs of chocolate to help him, because the watch wasn't any good. It only had sand in it, and I knew it wasn't good. Of course, he proudly showed his Wallace and Bishop's special watch, around. And of course they said, where'd you get that? Oh, I bought it for 2 slabs of chocolate. Of course, he was sent to the Russian front. Skipper Palmer was sent to camp, and I was sent to this punishment camp straight away, down to Gravina, PG 65. I had a sergeant and 3 swatties, 3 privates, accompanied me on that train. Took after me. I was a dangerous prisoner. Cheapers.
For one black market deal.
One black market.
Watch and
attempting to escape was the crime. Never attempted any escape at all.
Just wanted some chocolate.
That's right. So anyway, we got down to the camp there now. In our compound, probably 600 fellas, maybe 550, something like that. And they were dying at the rate of about 5 or 6 a week.
What's happening in the punishment camp? How's that different from a normal
rations?
treatment?
Well, the water was only on from 12 noon to 2 p.m, no longer. That's it. Rations were very, very meagre. And I can't quite remember it exactly, but we got like 14 broccoli bushes and 12 cabbage bushes. Now, that's with roots and all. So what the cooks did, they just hosed it off, smashed everything up into a sort of a shredded pulp, roots and all, and just boiled it up and served as a gruel. 600 men, that's all, 2 days' rations, that's what it was. Now, they had a little bit of puree, they kept in a little bit of meat extract, so they put some flavour in it, but it was virtually water, just a little bit of green stuff floating around in it. No wonder they were dying. Now, we never got a Red Cross parcel in that camp, not one. Lads told me that they originally were 3,000 in Tripoli, and 1,000 came to that camp, and they were down to 600. They didn't know whether they died or whether they'd been sent to other camps or what, but they were very despondent. What happened after, I don't know, because I was...
You weren't in that camp very long?
No, 4 weeks. I was sent up to Udine to the Dominion camp, which was Australian and New Zealanders, and there were a few camp PG 57 there, Udine, a little place called Grupignano, which was governed by a...
Calcaterra?
Calcaterra, yes, lovely fella.
I've got a quote here about Calcaterra, actually. Calcaterra's regime reduced the camp to a mass of neuroses, as no one knew when his turn would come to be victimised. An Australian doctor recorded that 10 Australians died. The number saved by Red Cross aid, the doctor wrote, is beyond computation.
That's right.
Calcaterra died before he could be tried as a war criminal.
Yeah.
Can you describe for our listeners Camp PG-57, sort of what the location was like, the complex, who the other prisoners were, where it was, and the day-to-day life? It
was about 30 miles from Trieste on the Gulf of Yugoslavia, about 18 from Udine as we call it. It's Udine, but Udine. And this is a little place called Grupignano, which is just a flat area, sandy soil. The Australian prisoners of war engineering group, they actually built the camp. Timber structure was started by the Italians, but they've really finished it. They put in the watering system, the toilet system, the shower system, in the roadways. They made sure that the traffic way was all done. There was 4 compounds, and each compound there's roughly 700 blokes, or 800 something, a couple of thousand Australians and probably 1,200 New Zealanders, something like that. Our section, number 2 compound, was run by Sergeant Major Alan Beecroft from Tasmania. And he had a runner, his boy used to go in and do all the running, and the doctor was Captain Levings from South Australia, medical, and there were quite a medical corps group in there, which had been captured. Now, he saved so many men in that camp. It's unbelievable to me what he did. The Red Cross came to assess those that should be sent back home, and they, International Red Cross, and they assessed them, they put through. They put my name through, and I said to Dr. Leverett, I'm walking. They won't. I can't go home. They wouldn't let me go. He said, no, they won't. But he said, we've got to make numbers up so as to get the really wounded blokes away. And that's how it worked. Maybe only 10 people went, I don't know. But he said, you've got to put numbers up to make sure that they witness what's going on here. But it was a shocking camp. This bloke used to come on parade. A man in the next compound wouldn't stand up and salute him. He'd send him in the boob for 2 weeks, bread and water, because he didn't stand up. And he's 150 yards away, for God's sake. And if there was a misdemeanor, he didn't punish that bloke. He punished 6 others, just him, bang.
And send them to isolated confinement.
That's right. And this is the cruelty of it all. But there was the funny side in that camp also. I mean,
did you guys have things like theatre troupes or other entertainment you guys tried to do?
They did in number 1 compound, not in number 2. They were really getting started on that when the Italian War finished. The boys played 2 up. Now, there was a payment program on. You get a little card about that size, which was marked 10 lira. It was run by a bloke called Sock Simons and Cocky Walpole. That was 2 blokes, both from Victoria. Cocky was a Polish Jew who'd been in trouble with the police and was given the choice: join the army or go to jail. He joined the army. You know, he was a real tough little boy. He was. The Sock Simons was a rough larrikin type. I decided that the thing for me to do was to back tails, because everybody at the back heads was the thing to do. So I just throw my money and I'd lose it, or cigarettes, whatever I had. But one day I broke the bank, 13 straight tails.
Wow.
Now I had so much money and cigarettes, I took it to the hut, Knocker West, and I said, Knocker, take all this, go to the little store, just buy grog. I don't care what you get, just buy grog. And now a hut, frankly, I don't remember that day. I haven't got a clue. I didn't go on parade. One day I wasn't a POW. Now, poor old Socks, not shortly after, not far on after that, I was sitting outside Alan Beecroft's hut, which is the top of the parade ground. The main huts were down there. And Sock Simons and Cocky, they were playing about. They'd had a few charges from their really ill-gotten gains, and they had probably a couple of wines as well. But Socks was playing around, and the guard was in the camp and shot him dead. Just got him right bang.
What was the provocation or the excuse?
Trying to escape. He was in the middle of the compound. He was acting the fool, certainly. He might have felt victimised or having a go at him, but really there was no provocation. Anyway, they sent him on a fortnight's leave and 500 lira bonus.
Bonus?
Bonus. And, of course, he was reported after the war. Of course, I know that he's brought to justice. I don't know what happened.
There would have been other witnesses.
Oh, plenty. Plenty of people gave witness to Alan Beecroft. Oh, yes.
And when you, though, had your 24-hour blackout haze, that wasn't picked up on? You weren't punished for that?
I must have been sick. Probably Dr. Leverett fixed that. I wouldn't have a clue.
Nondescript liver poisoning.
No, yes. Yeah.
What were your feelings on being in prison? Did you feel like I should be out there helping the war efforts? Did you feel any shame? How did you internalise it?
You felt a little shame. Of course you did. But the main thing was survival. Help your mates, keep going, walk around, make sure. Now, food was terribly hard. I can remember walking around the compound. Now, Parmesan cheese was the staple cheese that was served. Now, as you know, there's a pretty thick crust on that of the cheesecloth, and it's pretty thick. It used to be cut off by the cookhouse staff, and each hut in turn would get their pieces of cheese to suck. Well, I can remember one day I was walking back to the hut, and there was a piece of a little square like that on the ground. Somebody dropped it. I picked it up. And I sucked that. I can remember sucking that so long, until it got right down to the actual cheesecloth on the inside. It was hungry. We had berry, which was swelling your knees and joints and so forth. But we had a few Indians in the camp. And Dr. Evans worked it out. He couldn't understand it because they didn't suffer from berry. And he approached them and they said, we eat the weed. weed. We call it pigweed in Queensland. It was a very small leaf but very full of juice. And this was the vitamin B. Boiled it up, got cured. And we did get medical parcels from the Red Cross there, which he doled out, and it was cured. We got rid of it all right. But the parcel that Calcateras do, give you 1 to 6 men, then he give you 3 in a row, then starve you again. You know, sort of keep you guessing all the time what's going to happen. 19 of the fellas escaped, dug a tunnel out and got through.
Were you involved or were you aware of that?
No, look, at that stage, my stomach had ruptured in so many places. I couldn't lift anything. I had 5 ruptures on the actual wound itself. I could play cricket, but I couldn't hit the ball into the bat. It hurt too much, but I could slow bowl.
So it was easier just to get by day by day.
And I took 8 wickets for 2 runs one day, which was fantastic. But the bloke that Fitzy Vincent was in our camp, he was a sergeant with Charlie Upton, double VC for New Zealand, and his grandson played Test cricket for New Zealand here in Melbourne. It's nice to see. But food-wise, what we did do, we had groups of 2, 3 or 4. Mostly we had 3. And what we used to do is pool the food. If somebody got a parcel from a home of food, or not food, but clothing with a little bit of food in it, we used to swap that round. So we didn't sort of keep it to ourselves. You shared it and made sure that you helped your mate. It was remarkable how strong you could get by helping each other.
It gave you a purpose.
It was a purpose, a view. We used to run little lottos when the war going to finish.
Well, on that, did you get much news going through your time in that camp?
In Italy, very little. There were wireless sets there. They had them. But very little news was given out to all prisoners. It was certainly hut commanders and Alan Beecroft, those sort of area commanders, well, they got the news. People like myself, no. You got sparse news. There's an advance going on or the retreats on, but not just generally speaking. But in Germany, it was entirely different.
Before we get to Germany, what was the greatest hardship of PG 57?
Was the unexpectedness of what was going to happen to you. I mean, they would call a parade at 2 o'clock in the morning in the middle of winter, and you'd stand out there for an hour, nothing. Just stand there.
And what's the point of playing games with you guys? You're prisoners, you're out of...
Mental.
That's sadistic.
Exactly. That was it. But it was very hard not to succumb to that. They were a tough mob. Gee, you just had to fight it all.
How did you keep yourself fighting?
Well, we walked in the mornings, we talked to each other, we played a game of cribbage or whatever, made sure we understood what was going on in the camp. Now, our value of food was, in the ration, it was only 1,085 calories a day. Today, it's considered 3,000 to survive. So without that extra little Red Cross parcel to that 10 lira they used to help us buy by gambling something, everybody didn't get benefit, but if you worked the system properly, you survived. My weight when I went into the camp was 6 stone 4, 88 pounds, roughly 40 kilos. Well, that's not very much. And I stayed that weight in Italy. I never gained. I might have gained 1 or 2 pounds, but very, very little. We got round. We managed to move, and that's you keep going, keep moving.
Well, you did keep moving as well beyond PG 57.
Yeah.
When do you leave that camp and where do you go to?
The war finished with Italy on the 23rd of September 1943. The guards all ran away, and most of the staff ran away too, but there were a few Italians left in the actual area. But we were told by the British, message came into the camp, we were not to move, we would be relieved within 3 or 5 days. Now, we're in the north of Italy, for God's sake, 200 miles from the front, which is down about Rome. The very next day, we were surrounded by Germans.
That's very impressive that you all still maintain that discipline to follow orders, even though you'd been through the camp that whole time. And
otherwise, you'd be a rabble, you'd be target. If you went out, the Germans are still occupying northern Italy now. If everybody just ran out, that's not going to do any good at all for the bulk of the men.
That must have been devastating when the Germans surrounded you guys.
Oh.
To have that taste of freedom.
Yeah, euphoria. He's up now. And bang, caught. So we would put it on in these cattle trucks. Now, the cattle truck was for 12 horses or 24 men. But 50 to 60 prisoners were printed in each truck. Now, these cattle trucks were locked up, except up in the top left-hand corner, there was a window about the size of that top section of that door there, just where that bar runs across. And that opened. That was open. It had wire on it, but it was open. Air could come through.
1.5 square foot.
So what we did, we organised in the hut. Badly wounded or sick people, we arranged a corner they stayed in, but near that draft. And we took turns to get the fresh air, because it was all foul by the time you came back here. It was stinking air because there's so many bodies in there. And on the way, attempts were made to escape. We could hear them going. I had no inclination of escaping because I was too weak. I knew I couldn't do it. But some did get away. In fact, it was surprising the number that got out of that train and did get over to Switzerland. I don't know how many, but it was amazing that people got through. One fellow friend of mine who's died many, many years ago, a New Zealander, he joined the partisan, he killed 5 Germans. Finally, when we did get to Stalag 4B, we were on the parade ground. There was not even huts available for us. They had erected tents.
Tell me more about life in Stalag 4B and how it differed and was better or worse.
To live in tents in the middle of winter in Germany, it's not very good. But we managed, unfortunately, you see, but while we had greatcoats in Italy, when the moved on, the trains were organised by the Germans, you didn't have much time. Now, my 2 friends, Sandy Mostyn and Jimmy Edwards, both took their overcoats, but an Indian pinched mine, so I arrived in Germany just in battle dress.
In a tent in winter?
In a tent in winter.
And you've got nothing on you to really keep you warm?
Well, I had
no weight?
Nothing else, no.
But you're so lean and skinny as well.
That's right,
and
yeah.
malnourished.
Anyway, we coped, but by Christmas time we had moved into these huts. Well, life in Stalag 4B was much more organised once we got there, because being prisoners from Italy, we had our huts organised immediately in the queue groups, the numbers and the bedding and so forth. Everything was done. Up to then, the Air Force in that area, that what they called the Air Force camp, they didn't have a clue. You know, they were there, but they were prisoners, but they had no organisation, like a hut commander and people to do this and do that. The Italian prisoners who were coming up, all the Australian and New Zealand, they knew what to do, how to survive, how to get your beds made, to make sure you had a shower. And all. I'm sorry to say, but some of the British Air Force boys, they'd say they were out of like Civvy Street into a prison camp. They didn't know where they were, what they were doing. By Christmas and January that year, they were all organised properly. They had all the skilly rows and everything was done. They had their numbers and things would really run really well in that camp.
Are there any standout memories from that camp you'd like to share with me?
The strongest memories of that camp are the funny ones. Not funny, they're funny now, weren't they? But
please tell me.
Fuel was a problem always in that camp. Not in Italy so much, because although it was cold, we did have some warmth. We had these huts were built. They were 10 metres wide, 30 metres long, and in the middle then was an ablution block with another hut the same size back onto it. So there's literally 400 men sleeping in that confinement. So you had to have things organised. Now, the first thing we had to do was fuel. Now, we were given a coal allotment to keep that fire going so you could heat up the vegetables or the stuff that you got from the Red Cross parcels or the food that was allocated to you. Of course, we ran out very quickly, so what to do? So we all slept on what was called bedboards. There was 14 bedboards to each bed on the palliasse on top. So then we'd say, right, 1 bedboard each, come in. So we'd chop it up, split it, use that as fuel. Then another. Well, I finished up with, I think it was 9 or 10 bedboards, I can't remember now. But Canadian Red Cross parcels, which we did get really spasmodically, but they all came in 3-ply boxes. By using bedboards as handles on the sides and reinforcing the bottom with bedboards, you could carry coal in it. And we had a coal consignment. Now, I was only a cockatoo. I couldn't lift anything. But Sandy Mostyn used to go out with them. And this big Kiwi pilot, I wish I could remember his name. He was a fantastic bloke. He used to organise these raids. Now, the German coal, they're very regimented. They know exactly what they do. The truck arrives, it tips the coal out, and it's always in the front. Now, the doors on there were padlocked, huge big doors. but they had hinges on spigots. So we lift the doors off, open them up, go in and get the coal from the back. Bring it out, back into the hut, with the cockatoos watching for the guards to come round, give a whistle, and they'd stop. So we had coal, we'd stick it up in the roof of the hut, and we never went short of fuel. At the same time, for 10 cigarettes, we could buy 100 weight of coal from the mine, from the actual distributing centre, because you paid off the guards, the driver of the truck, and even back, they sort of even went back as far as the holding area manager. He got his cigarettes as well. Cigarettes were marvellous. They were money. I've seen one cigarette sell for £1 sterling. A loaf of bread was 5 cigarettes. A tin of condensed milk was 5 cigarettes. Now, I didn't smoke. Now, I was smoking in Italy. A tin of capsules of 50 used to cost, from the British money, 4 shillings and sixpence, 45 cents. 50 cigarettes. God knows what they are today. So I got pleurisy, and I went to see Doc. I didn't know what I had. I had something. Left side was crooked. He went on to see Doc Levin. He said, well, Jack, you've got pleurisy. Now, he said, I've got nothing to do. But he said, I'll tell you what, you continue smoking, you'll die. Give up cigarettes and you'll live. It's your choice. I gave cigarettes up right that moment. I never smoked again, not even today.
Jack, as we are recording this, it's December 2017. You're turning, you're turning 100 in a couple of weeks. Could you have possibly conceived back then, you're in these camps, you're 40-odd kilos, you are absolutely emaciated, malnourished, suffering all kinds of diseases and other complications. Could you have possibly imagined you were going to live to triple figures?
Never doubted it. Oh, no, sorry. Never doubted I'd live. Well, in fact, the Gestapo sent some young trainees into the camp to, indoctrinate us. And we just laughed at them. They said, no, you won't win the war. You think you're not winning the war. No, we'll win the war. Don't worry about that. We're the side with the most food. Of course, the German people were starving. The actual population, they had as much, about the same rations that we were getting. And what we were buying contraband from the Germans, that 5 cigarettes bought them probably 3 loaves of bread. So that, it was all a bartering system going on. Although they could sell us from that, they still helped them to keep going.
It's remarkable, though, you had that such positivity that, no, I'm going to live and you're going to lose.
I think in the main, I don't think that maybe not Australian or New Zealand, I don't think any of us ever thought we wouldn't survive or wouldn't win the war. When was the different proposition, of course, because it just went on and on and on. But we could tell once America came into the war, like 41 when they came, well, the food and the supplies was built up and built up. It just inundated the whole. Food in the Stalag 4B was more nutritious than it was in the Italian camp. But potatoes were 4 years old. It was all right for 2 years, possibly 3, but by the 4th year, the potatoes had rotted. So when they came to the camps, sometimes they were reasonable. You get half a potato out of a potato. But by the end of the war, the stuff we were getting, they used to hose it on the floor and just boil it, and you'd eat the white part and throw away the bad part. But there was enough food to survive, irrespective of what it was. It could have been barley, sauerkraut, pickled vegetables. Sugar beet was one of the staple foods. You have sugar beet, boil them up. They're like big beetroots, but sugary. That would be the meal, just sugar beet.
How was the treatment by your German captors compared to the Italian ones? Well,
you stayed there and behaved yourself, you're all right. But, of course, we used to bedevil them with the fire, with the firewood. Well, it was just this key to decide that we needed more fuel for the fire, so we're going to steal the fence. We gave the Russian colonel in charge of the Russian company, there were probably 15,000, 18,000 Russians in this camp, 100 cigarettes to take care of the wire. So the first Sunday, all we did was remove the cleats with the pinchers that we had. Every second stringer post, we'd take a cleat out so the wire sagged a little bit, but not noticeable. Then the next weekend, we did a few more. And so then in the finish, we took the little stringer posts about this out completely. Now the Germans came in, the wire was still there. They come down, count us, walk out, go around the next compound. So then the big day came when we had to steal the whole fence. Now this was only the main poles and the barbed wire. As we had said, we had organised with the Russian compound about the wire, so As we took the cleats out and pulled it off, a number of prisoners were working, and we rolled the wire, rolled it into the Russian compound, and they dealt with it. We dug the posts out of the soil. Not that I did much, I couldn't. But, we had picks, had all sorts of tools, and we dug the poles out, saw them up, stuck them up in the ceiling. Monday morning, Blondie arrived down with his gang to count us, and he walked into the compound. Countess walked out, went out through the gate and round to the next compound again. Next morning he came in, he saw the fence was gone. Wow, did he blow. So he locked us in. Unbeknownst to him that one of our boys was a Scottish swaddy who'd just changed over the sergeant pilot to on this to get escape. And he'd come and taken his place in the camp. And in Borstal, in the boys' prison camp in jail in Scotland, they trained him as a locksmith. So, of course, these locks, it was a big lock, just an ordinary hoop lock. Blondie had gone well back from here to the back fence, and a big here we got it. Blondie! And the gates were wide open. They just held the chain and with the padlock in it like that. Blondie went for his gun and realised, no, don't be an idiot. They'd kill me. So he stormed off. And we stole the whole fence.
Were there any further repercussions or fallout from that?
Well, this was the end of 1944. Things were a bit too difficult to do anything very much about. They were looking to their own sort of self-preservation.
Tell me about the day you were set free.
We were set free by the Russians on the 24th of April 1945. The colonel of the Russians rode in on a pony with his men behind him dressed in civilian suits, which they'd pinched out of the German, I don't know what they called them, but they had kept all of these civilians to give them to the soldiers when they came back. They said in the uniform. And some of them had suits on, they were riding bicycles and all sorts of little motorbikes. They recaptured, they didn't release us. They recaptured us. Their treatment to us, they couldn't care less. Food, they allowed us to eat what we possibly could for 48 hours out of the compound's kitchen supplies. We ate all that. Then, of course, more food. So Sandy Moss and I went outside and we found some rhubarb, picked this rhubarb, took it back and cooked, of course, got dysentery. But the actual food, they said, if you walk past, we had a circle around the compound, what you could grab in your hand, that was your food for the day. Because they lived off the land. They didn't get rations, the Russians. They lived off the land, what they pinched. Amazing, it's an amazing system. But anyway, we were marched to a little place called Risa, which was where the actual young boys were trained as the troops in this camp. Now, that was the repair area for the Russian tanks. They were all repairing all vehicles, engines and tanks and stuff there. So we were affiliated in the huts around. And 5 of us decided that we're not going to stay here anymore. Best thing that we could escape. We went for a walk round the little village of Risa, and in the back, always in the back, never go into the front of the shops in an occupied country, because in the rubbish dumps, that's where they hid their stuff, because they didn't want it taken by the Russians. So we found a bottle of brandy, 3-star Hennessy brandy, and just then some Russian boys came down with a box of tinned meat, so we swapped half and half. We went back to our little section where we were in this kitchen of this boys' camp, and we sort of decided we'd open the bottle, let's have a sip. So we only had a little sip each, but we kept on sipping. I was told later that I abused the Russians in the camp in this repair workshop so badly that they whisked me off, and my friends took me, so I don't remember anything about that. But at the same time, we decided to get out, and the 5 of us left the very early the next day. Now, the frontline troops, the Russians, were just like anybody else's frontline troop. We got rides on trucks, we got help from where to go. We had to make them towards Halle, over the Elbe, 30, 40 kilometres, I suppose. We were walking, and we stayed overnight in a farmhouse, and they fed us bread, milk and cheese, and asked us, could we stop the Russians taking the food from them out of the dairy? I said, we can't stop the Russians. That's how they live. They come and just take what they want. You'll get nothing. We can't help you. So we moved on the next day and came to the Elbe, and across the Elbe, the bridges were all down, but there was a structure across that you could walk across. And across we could see a big American master sergeant. They had ribbons up and down and also he was well decked out. And he just said, come. So we walked across, and then they interrogated us that we were actually Australians. And the first thing they did was give us a box of K rations. The worst thing they did, because immediately we got dysentery because we couldn't resist the food.
And you ate too much.
Ate too much. But they said the very next day, we're flying you to Brussels and you'll be returned to England on the 18th of May. Now, when we got to Brussels, we landed at this aerodrome. A motley group we were, you can imagine, 20 or 30 in this DC-3 thing. And we were met by the Belgian Red Cross ladies with slices of white bread and a glass of milk. Now, that white bread was just white bread. It just tasted like cake to me. It was so sweet and beautiful. I hadn't had white bread for nearly 2, 3, 4 years.
You wouldn't have had sugar intake.
No, well, we had a little bit of sugar. But
not as much as you'd be concentrated as white bread.
No. Next day, off we went to England on a Lancaster.
And then you made your way home.
Well, went down to Brighton, of course, and stayed there for a while, and then I toured the United Kingdom, going to see my mother's and father's relatives, and came back, and we set out in the Orion and got back to Australia at the end of August. Well, I kissed the ground when I landed in Woolloomooloo, I can tell you. Well, I was in hospital. They repaired my wounds and all that sort of stuff. I was discharged in January 46. And I went back to my old job at D&W Murray at this warehouse and stayed there for a few years. And I was offered a position in Melbourne. I got sick. As you can see, I've got a problem of eczema on my head. And the doctor said, well, he said, you can either go and live in Roma or go to Melbourne, where you can have a variable weather or dry weather in Roma. So I'll go to Melbourne. So I managed to get a position in Melbourne and came down to represent a mill from Stawell, which is a woolen mill. We making 500 pieces of cloth a week and sold every one of them without any trouble for years. No problem at all. Today there's not one mill left. There were 14 then.
And when did you meet your wife, Dolores?
I met her in March 1946 when I came to Melbourne on a buying trip. And she was a girl working in the mill office. I didn't know I was going to be in the mill office eventually, and I used to buy from that mill. We used to buy a lot of cloth from it.
And when did you marry? We
married in May 1954.
Did you find it difficult to readjust to civilian life?
Yes, very difficult. Mentally, I was talking about these young boys coming back today. Well, the same thing, but we were very, very fortunate. There were so many of us that we managed to get together, we'd drink together, talk together. We'd go on these holidays and we'd laugh and tell all the funny side, but our wives never really knew what we did, what we suffered, what we went through. And it wasn't, as I said, until late 80s that I did anything about it. But I'm sure that was the reason that we recovered so well. Look, I still have nightmares. It never goes, that anxiety state. It's down, it's dormant, it's in there. They'll never get rid of it, but you can't control it up to a point. I know they get panic attacks. I know they do. They might not admit it, but I know they do because I still get panic attacks.
Is it something that has impeded now or in the past on your life greatly? Or?
Well, I did suffer from a lack of confidence. Being subjected like a prisoner, you sort of subjugate all the time. You're kept down. It was a problem there. I've overcome that, but 3 of my friends, now with only 150 Australians in that Stalag 4B, that's all Air Force, and 3 that I know drank themselves to death. Just literally drank themselves to death because they couldn't get out of it. They couldn't help it. So I'm a lucky man.
In the first few years, first decade after the war, and if people are asking, did you serve or what have you, and you said you became a prisoner of war, did you encounter any negative reactions to being taken prisoner, or was it intrigue, or they didn't want to talk about it with you? Or
Unfortunately, we were approached as if we were to blame for being prisoners. Now, you must remember that the Japanese were such a colossal threat to Australia. Particularly people in the northern parts of Australia were very visibly affected by the possibility that the Japs were coming here. And all those prisoners taken, whole division of prisoners, there were a hell of a lot of people from Queensland and northern New South Wales in that division. And people have said to me, not many, but some have, why did you go and fight in Europe? You should have been here fighting the Japanese. I was a prisoner before the Japanese came in the war. But they didn't want to understand that. But I can understand their thinking because, it's ours, our people. Why weren't you here?
What motivates you now to tell your story?
Our daughter Sandra did that. She got stuck into me. And I've tried to influence other POWs to write their story, do their story, but some still haven't. I lecture at schools, I go to probers clubs and golf clubs and tennis clubs. And I just tell my story, not anybody else's, my story. It's paid dividends for me. One gentleman said to me, he said, Jack, he said, you're giving, you're not taking. That's wonderful praise.
I fully agree, because the courage and the strength to share such great hardship and experiences I can't possibly relate to, it's a real testament to you. And there, you're speaking on behalf of those who can't share it with us today or are not willing to. And it's not just a record for your generation and the war you went through. It's the trauma and the details are different, but it's something relatable to the conflict we had in Vietnam and the conflict we have today in Afghanistan and Iraq. And
I felt terribly sorry when the boys came back from Vietnam. They were ostracised. I couldn't understand it. It was awful.
how do you look at the wars that have been fought in this century and the men and young men and women who have fought in them?
I'm terribly sorry for them. I really feel for them. I see these young boys, they just sent away and away they go. Awful.
How do you look back and summarise your wartime experience, looking back with the benefit of nearly 100 today?
I wouldn't wish it on anybody, but I'm very pleased that I went through it. But it taught me a lot of things. It taught me tolerance, compassion and respect.
Jack, you've had an incredible life with experiences.
Just an ordinary bloke, just don't worry.
You might be an ordinary bloke, but you've lived an extraordinary life.
Well, a bit different, let's say.
A bit different than mine. It's beyond my comprehension. Thank you for serving our country, for persevering against the odds, and for speaking with me about it today.
Thank you, Alex. I appreciate your interview. Thank you very much indeed.
My conversation with Jack Bell is the last episode for Season 2 of Life on the Line. If you enjoyed the episode, please go to iTunes or Apple Podcasts and leave us a 5-star rating and review. Make sure you're subscribed in your podcast app of choice to know when we're back. Don't worry, it won't be too long. Keep in touch on social media. We're on Facebook and Instagram at Life on the Line Podcast and on Twitter at LOTL Pod. Email us at podcast@lifeonthelinepodcast.com and visit our website, www.lifeonthelinepodcast.com. Our website has more information about our World War II documentary and our book. On the website, you can also sign up for our email newsletter. Get images of our guests, information about the podcast, and updates straight to your inbox, so you never miss an episode. Life on the Line is brought to you by Alex Lloyd, Angus Horden, Thomas Kay, Sharon Maskell-Dare, and Rohan Viswalingam of Thistle Productions. Our artwork is by Mark Thacker of Big Cat Design. Our music is by Dan Van Werkhoven of Mark IV Multimedia. Our thanks go to all those who help behind the scenes on this show. Special thanks go to Kate Davis, an Air Force veteran herself, and she has one of the biggest hearts I know. Thank you all for listening. We hope you found these stories as memorable as we have. And, as always, lest we forget.